So I was actually filling up, but no, I'm pretty direct. But I like to think I'm open, and that's what I mean with strong opinions loosely held. Okay. And maybe after the talk, you will think, okay, you're pretty opinionated, No, okay. So yeah, and I've been maintaining an open source project, and this is not about the project itself, not about Fluent Assertions, which is the project that I'm talking about. This is more like what I learned from that, what we practice, what we apply, and I'm actually using that same knowledge in my clients' projects. I'm a consultant, which means I go into the clients, I work there usually for a long period, like 1, 2, 3 years, trying to change the entire development workflow. And I think I've sourced a lot of this we'd say ideas and tools and practices from Fluent Assertions. But it goes both ways. Sometimes I run into a problem at my client's project, and then I use Fluent Assertions to try something new. And that's great. That's really, really valuable, I have to say. So, what you can learn from that project. That's basically it. And that's my name. This is me. I like to call myself a hands-on architect, which basically means I like to find any opportunity, any excuse I can have to actually be coding and not being in meetings. And up to now, I'm 50 now, I've managed to find that balance. So half of my time I'm still coding, a little bit more. The other half I'm doing code reviews. No, I'm actually meeting with managers. But yeah, I've been able to balance that. I'm going off topic already, but it doesn't matter. I think it's one of the biggest challenges of software developers. At some point in their career, they're trying to figure out, should I become a manager to earn more money? Should I become an architect? I like to think it doesn't really matter as long as I was going to use the word passion, but David also said that's a negative word. So now I check all the boxes that he mentioned this morning. I see passion as something that's positive, somebody who actually cares. And it doesn't mean I'll try to convince you that my way is the right way, which is true. But no, I don't know even how I got that. But anyway, yeah, so I'm a coding architect. I've been doing this for 27 years. I started with C, C++. I actually started programming when I was 11 on my Commodore 64. I don't know those people. Yes, I look at the people with gray hair or no hair. They may remember all of this. Switched to C, then C++. Later on, I discovered I discovered C#. I got addicted to it. I love it. I know there's other languages. David just told us we should all look at other languages. I also like TypeScript, which happens to look like C#. Yes, not a coincidence. Same designer. I'm a Microsoft MVP since a year. I'm up for review in a month, so I have no clue what it means if you actually get extended. We'll see, which gives me... no, I shouldn't say that. It's recorded. And I'm on Twitter, and I'm also on other kind of channels. Who cares? I have a couple of things. I have a blog. Nobody cares about that. I have coding guidelines, which I maintained for the last 23 years, I think, which you can fork and adapt for your own organization. There's also tools around it. I've been doing a lot of event sourcing. I don't know if you've heard about this architecture style. So I created my own library because, that's what you do. You build your own stuff because, you don't like using other people's stuff. I have a BDD style testing framework, which I adopted. And of course, I have Fluent Assertions. In case anybody from the .NET space? Okay. Anybody using Fluent Assertions? Okay, a couple of people. The rest doesn't care. Okay, cool. No worries. So about the project, this is actually what it is. It's the stupid little library that you use in your automated tests to assert the outcome of a particular scenario. And you can do should contain, you can do like a particular action should throw an exception. You can use it to do a namespace verification. So you can use it a little bit for dependency tracking. You can actually compare entire object graphs in a smart way. And for some reason became popular. How? Why? I have no clue. It is apparently a little bit successful. I still remember the first time that somebody wrote a blog post about it. Like, why would you write a blog post about my little library? I still don't understand it. And as people ask me like, I'm an open source. What made it successful? I said, dude, I have no clue. If you know it, because I have other projects that are not as successful. We'll see. Anyway, why is it? Okay, maybe because it's a library. Libraries are usually easy to replace. If you don't like it, you rip it out. It has lots of stuff like clean code. It has, a clear release strategy. It is designed using test-driven development. I'm a big proponent of test-driven development. I went through the pain. I've shot myself in my feet, but I still love it. And I don't know if this is the reason, but apparently people like it. So I have a lot of slides, a lot of things to share. I try to structure it a little bit by saying, like from the idea, the issue that you create all the way to production. So it looks a bit like a well-designed structural presentation, which is never the case with me because I always go off script. I also love questions. So you have questions, if you have comments, if you don't like it, let me know. Then we can change the subject. I can also talk about other topics, by the way. What is it like to, I don't know, be in Sydney or something? It all starts with issues. That's what it starts with. So when people actually go to GitHub, they'll find the Fluent Assertions organization, which has obviously the main project, also has a couple of side projects which are not maintained by myself and my partner Jonas, but it's more like we wanted to offer a place for semi-official contributors or semi-official extensions to be able to do. So you can actually find that. The next step is you want to create an issue. Like with every project, it's very difficult to control and understand and organize issues. People create issues for everything. Sometimes it's an actual bug report, sometimes it's a requirement, sometimes it's a question. Fortunately, in GitHub these days, there's a nice template that you can set up. So if you actually create an issue, this is what you get. So you can actually choose what you want. And this is built in GitHub, so you can actually use it yourself. Like, is it indeed a bug report? Is it an API suggestion? I'll talk about this in a minute. But also links to the documentation. Obviously, it's an open source project. So we want you to sponsor the project because we don't do it. Ask on Stack Overflow. I should remove that. As I just mentioned, concluded, nobody's using Stack Overflow. Maybe I should say ask ChatGPT or something like that. That makes sense. We do have a Slack. This is nice because I also use it in my client's project because it streamlines this whole process. It forces people to think like, I'm not just going to dump something. It doesn't work, you know, like clients or like users actually do. But it streamlines this process. And you can actually change all that. There's a nice YAML format you can choose in your GitHub project. Is anybody using GitHub professionally? Oh, Azure DevOps? I'm sorry for you people. Yeah, I'm sorry. Jira, that is not for source control. Or Bitbucket, or GitLab. Bitbucket also. No, I'm not going to say that. Everything is being recorded. So that's one thing. The other thing is we get so many requests now that we actually want to streamline the requests for a new feature. And we don't want, because what happens, you know, you have these people that really love to contribute and they say, okay, I want to be part of this Fluent Assertion thing. I'm going to create a pull request with this nice feature, this nice new API that they spent weeks on. And then we look at it and think, that's a bit niche. That doesn't fit in the code base. And then we reject it. And we didn't do that all the time. We actually accepted the feature. I don't know if you're in the .NET space, you may remember this ancient feature called datasets. We accepted the pull request where somebody added dataset support. That was a mistake. And that led us to actually introduce a process to approve this whole thing. And that's nice because you can use labels for that. So whenever somebody submits a proposal, we actually have labels to identify what's the level of that. So initially it's an API suggestion, then we have some discussions about it, like a real project, figuring out whether it fits in the whole project, whether it should actually be a separate extension or something, separate library. And only when it's approved and people actually want to help us, they can create a pull request. They shouldn't do that before. Sometimes they do, but then it's more like a draft, like to help understand the feature. Because you can imagine it's a stupid little library, but apparently it's like based on my history, it can be very complicated to keep it consistent, to actually think about all the edge cases. And then you can actually see it like that. Very simple thing. Labels can be used. As I said, it's not trivial. It is a library, but it has complexity in it. It has to be consistent. I like to believe that one of the aspects that made it successful is maybe that it's very intuitive. That doesn't come from like out of the blue. We have to actually think about that and experiment with that. So we have lots of challenges like, does it actually fit in the main library? Is this going to cause breaking changes? Because we really care about the versions and the versioning strategy, just like every other project. Anybody doing semantic versioning? Okay, that's good, actually. It's a pretty good group doing that. But also consistency, like this one, should all satisfy. That sounds, you pass in a predicate and you expect all items in a collection to satisfy that predicate. That's easy, right? But what if the collection is empty? Should that fail or should that succeed? That on itself can be a debate. Or if you compare records, C# you have records. How should it compare records? Records are value-typed objects. They have value semantics. Should we treat it as such? Or are people using records as a way to create data transfer objects? And if you compare to records, you actually want to compare the properties or something like that. That was a big discussion. And that is something we have to deal with. Okay, yeah, that's the rec I mentioned. By the way, tuple, same thing. Async postfix, that is almost like a holy war. Just like tabs versus spaces or using var, should we use the async postfix? That's tough. And the thing is, if you make the wrong decision, we have to maintain that for many years because we don't introduce breaking changes until the next major version. And that can take 2 or 3 years before we follow that. Just like a real project. That is something I have to deal with every day in my clients' projects as well. So if you start exploring the repositories, a couple of things which are interesting. A README. Who has a README on all their repositories? 1, 2. Okay. So the rest of the repository, you just clone it and then you're like, okay, now what? So I think there was a statement, I think it was Martin Fowler, said like, if I cannot clone your repository and get the application running in under 5 minutes, you're doing something wrong. That's a pretty bold statement, but I actually like to see that as a heuristic. A good README can help with that. Like, you know, what does it take to build it? What are the prerequisites? Is there a script that you can set up your environment? Of course, I use all these nice colored icons because that looks cool, you know, the coverage and everything. But that's a starting point. And I'm at the client right now, and none of the repo had a README. None of them, you know, and there was also no other place where you found the documentation. So I've actually made it a requirement as part of the source control guidelines or whatever you want to call it. There should be a decent README with the information that you need because people come and go. That's logic, the information that you do not want to lose. Contribution guidelines, same thing. I like to adopt this inner sourcing idea. I don't know if you know that. It's basically like an open source project. I like to apply that within the company, especially if there's multiple teams, lots of different repositories. I want to be able to remove any barrier where one team can contribute to another team's code base, because that increases the quality. Just like open source projects, they're very visible to the world. So usually the authors of the libraries or the projects care about the quality of the code. I like to see the same thing happening within the companies. It is not your hidden little repository that only a couple of people look at and the rest shouldn't care. No, it should be open. If you find a bug, if you see something is missing in the documentation, everybody should be able to go there, create a pull request, improve the documentation, suggest something, you know, with everything I showed you here. And that is part of that. Being able to contribute, understanding what is expected from that. I mean, this is a very elaborate example, but I've seen simpler ones, but that's perfectly okay. And GitHub actually has a nice built-in mechanism that you can actually find the guidelines, the contribution guidelines, if you use a particular name. A lot of people think that that's only for open source. No, inner sourcing is extremely valuable for the companies that I work with. Release notes. Yes, of course, we have release notes. And we have release notes like generated from Markdown files to also make a distinction between technical release notes and more functional release notes. I'll show you later on how we actually build those. But it's basically just a Markdown file. And it's part of the same code base, which means if somebody produces a pull request, they also have to include the functional documentation of that pull request, that change, so that they're always in sync, because the worst thing that can happen is that your documentation is out of sync with the implementation, which happens a lot in different projects. To actually work with Git, I use a lot of different tools. This is kind of how my environment looks like. I like colors. I don't know. I like colors. I use a lot of different tools. I use Windows Terminal because it allows me to use PowerShell, command line, and even a bash if I need to use that, all in the same window. I like to use PowerShell. I like to use Oh My Posh. That's the thing that creates all these colors. You can completely get nuts, can go nuts with all the different colors if you want to. But yeah, I use that a lot. I use PS Readline because I like to use my keyboard to go back into the history, you know, find the previous command. Because I like keyboards. I'm a typing person. I have suffered from RSI problems like 20 years ago. And since then, I've been adopting a more keyboard-focused way. But I'm not dogmatic about that. Unless I also like this. This is interesting because Phil Hack is actually here. So I still have to shake his hand and thank him for this article. This article is about a bunch of Git extensions or Git aliases that you define that will make your life a lot easier, especially if you use Git on the command line interface. I use zlocation, which is a very powerful CD command. So instead of typing CD, I'd use Z, and the Z will actually look in the history and find a folder that looks like that I visited regularly, which is nice because I always open a PowerShell command line. I type z.fluent and it jumps immediately to my working directory. I don't know if you heard about that. But I'm not dogmatic. I actually use a GUI tool as well. This is KitKraken. It's currently my favorite. So I actually use command line tools and the GUI. I use command line tools to quickly check out the branches, to quickly amend my changes, push my latest changes to a temporary branch. But when I'm ready to actually create a pull request, I use a visual tool to figure out which changes should belong together and which commit. I also use the built-in Git client that Rider has, JetBrains Rider, but I still like this. I like the visual. I like to have overview. I like to understand what's going on. So yeah, I use both. And apparently it's camps. There's people that only use the GUI, and there's people that only use CLI. It doesn't make sense to me. Just use both. They both have value, right? So in terms of patterns, this is still the same mistake. Things like tabs versus spacing or the maximum length of a line, all of this can be solved using editor config. You can put that there. You do it once for your repository and you never have to look back. And if you have a proper IDE, it can completely automatically format your code base continuously. With JetBrains Rider, or if you use Visual Studio with ReSharper, you can even have a shortcut key that will interpret all these settings, including the one which is specific for JetBrains, which is the .settings file, and even reformat and also apply coding style settings. If you understand, anybody who's programming on C#? I guess a big chunk of people. Oh no, not that many actually. It works actually with all the different tools. I also use it for TypeScript and JavaScript. You just auto-format everything, including ESLint if you're using, for example, TypeScript. And then you don't have, if you're in a C# space, you can also put all the JetBrains specific elements in there. And that's nice because then you don't have to bother about it. You don't actually have to mention them in code reviews because it will mostly happen automatically. Or the next time you do an auto reformat and everything will be fine and aligned with your standards. Also, if you're in the .NET space, there's a lot of analyzers that you can use that will automatically run in your code base whenever you compile that can improve the code base. Like XML comment formatting. Maybe if you use link, there's a lot of things you can do. You can do wrong, because causing performance issues. These analyzers will suggest improvements that will make your code base more efficient. And I learned a lot of things from these analyzers. Again, because there's people smarter than me, and there's probably everybody, that I learned from. The C# coding guidelines is actually the one that fits with my guidelines, will also allow you to detect additional things. Nested conditional statements, you have them in every language. This question mark and then the semicolon, that thing, remember? I think most languages have it. Some people actually like to nest them. Can you imagine how complicated that is to read? I mean, the whole point of my code is to be readable, understandable, without requiring a lot of cognitive load to be able to interpret what the code is doing. That helps with that. And long methods. Who has methods longer than 40 lines? Yeah? Is happy with it? No. Yeah. Well, I mean, I know that SonicCloud and SonicCube can actually detect that. But if you're in C#, you can even have that all the way before it runs in SonicCloud. So your feedback loop is much smaller. Simple things like single type or using the correct exception types, which you can do wrong. And if you're in the C# space, actually using proper async support. There's a lot of things you can do wrong. You would not be the first to define an async method and not awaiting it. And then being surprised in production that something doesn't work. Of course, if you practice test-driven development, you write all your unit tests, you don't have that problem. This is also a very generic thing. I've been looking for ways to name my tests. And there's a lot of different ways of doing it, a lot of different opinions about that. So this is what I used to do. These very long functional names. When something happens, it should do something else. I've been doing this for a long time. I still think personally, it's much better than class name, method name, scenario. I don't like that. I also don't like Pascal casing. I like this because it's almost like English, where the space are underscores. But I found this very verbose. So I've been looking for ways to make this more efficient. So I started actually using nested classes to group related scenarios. In this case, I'm using the name of an API, be same as, that's a method in the open source library, in Fluent Assertions. So I don't have to repeat that every time. But quite often I use capabilities here. So if it's a more functional code base, I use capabilities to group things in a related way because it basically removes all this noise from your method names, from your test names. But I found this still quite long, so I've been experimenting with things like this. And these days I've settled on this. Fact-based, very short names. I don't use words like when and should anymore. I just keep it very short, but short, not too short. It should still be verbose enough to understand what's going on within the context. So I don't repeat the name of the surrounding classes for that. I liked it. Again, strong opinions loosely held. Maybe I'll find something else in the future. It will change again. The problem, of course, you have to keep your code base consistent, and we haven't even done that. We're still renaming all the tests. We have like 6,000 unit tests. So yeah, renaming them one by one. We do that. Cool thing is we have contributors. So there's actually people that love to rename these things and create these pull requests. And I'm not joking. Apparently people like that. OCD, I guess so. Which I have myself, but yeah, I've learned to control that. Documenting exceptions. I know that in Java, it's pretty common to document your exceptions. I don't know. I like to think exceptions should not be documented because you shouldn't even use them. I mean, no, I have to rephrase that, sorry. I like to think that you should never catch them because exceptions are exceptions. If they happen, they should kill the application or fail the test, but you shouldn't actually catch them. Why would you catch an argument null exception? That's an internal error, right? If that ever happens in production, that's an internal error. Unless you want to swallow exceptions, but then you catch a generic one. So I don't see value in that. But there were people in the community that really thought it would be useful, and somebody created a pull request documenting all the exceptions. And we felt like, okay, maybe we should do it, you know, because that person really cared and he's also contributing really. Sometimes you have to, you know, pick your battles. So we do that as well. The nice thing is you get actually nice documentation in your IDE about the exception. Another .NET specific thing is if you have lots of projects in your solution, you can define a .props file and put everything that you would normally put in your CS project into this file, and it will be applied to everything in that directory, which is nice because if you have lots of projects, you can actually reuse settings. You only have to update the dependency once and will be applied everywhere. Again, .NET specific. And not everybody is programming .NET. Then I wonder, what's the rest actually programming in? Any? Or not programming at all? Architects, managers? Okay, fair enough. BDD style testing, that's another way of doing testing. So a lot of people probably know about this arrange, act, assert syntax that is being used a lot to structure your tests. Sometimes you have code that is more orchestrational by nature. So in that case, one action triggers multiple assertions. And for those particular scenarios, I like to use more what I call BDD style testing. Has nothing to do with behavior-driven development per se, because that's more organized or more oriented towards more the business people, for example. But the idea of given when then works. And this is an example of using the chill library. And what you can see here, for example, is that I use stuff like set the to a particular value. And then you can actually, in the fact, you can refer, no, not in the fact, a little bit up. In the when, you can refer to the subject. You can actually refer to objects. So you don't have to use private variables. Also cleans up things that need to be disposed, which is specific to .NET. You can check it out. It's just an alternative way of structuring your test. And we also use it in the open source library because we do actually have code that needs to be cleaned up because we have shared mutable state. Again, use one or the other. Actually, we use both because they both solve a problem that we have. If you're interested, check it out. Another specific thing in XUnit is if you create tests with a lot of different scenarios, you can use this theory attribute on top of that. And you can pass in a whole bunch of variables or arguments, and then the same test is executed multiple times. This used to be untyped. Now there's something called theory data, which is specific to XUnit that you can use, and then your test becomes actually type safe, which is nothing really major, but it's just a tiny thing to improve your code base. If you're in the .NET space and you program C#, one of the big struggles which a lot of people have, is they have to use old versions of .NET. Old versions as in still properly maintained, you know, have been in production for many years, but you cannot go to .NET Core or one of the newer versions. You're still stuck with 4.7. C# has a lot of improvements. Like if you use this one on the top, verbatim, the top line is pretty difficult to read. So if the previous character is an ampersand and the statement is longer than two characters, and the last but second item is a $sign, And the last one is an ampersand. And okay, very difficult to read. The bottom one is actually what you can do in newer versions of C#. I can just say the statement is a collection which ends with those two characters. Much more readable. Unless you're on .NET 4 point something, you cannot really use that. Similar with this one. You can do pattern expressions in C#. You could already do that in older versions, but it got a lot better recently. But again, you're stuck with .NET 4.8. If you use regular expressions, which you should never do, unless you have a problem that needs it, which can happen. I don't want to be dogmatic. Actually, if you put this string syntax attribute in front of it, then your IDE will actually display information, actually provide guidance how to interpret this regular expression. Except if you're an older .NET version, because you don't have that thing. But there's a solution, and it's called Polyshop. That's an open source library. It's a simple NuGet package. You add it to your project, and it will automatically polyfill all those missing parts. So even with .NET 4.8, you can only use the new C# syntax features. They will just light up automatically. And we use that as well in Fluent Assertions, because we do target all the versions of the .NET framework, because a lot of people are using that. This is what it looks like. It's basically using code generators, which is pretty new, but it works really, really nice. You can also write those classes yourself and put them in the system namespace. It works equally well. The .NET framework doesn't care. It's just syntactical sugar, and the runtime will pick it up for you. To build and test locally, yeah, there's one thing. Who likes YAML? Who likes YAML for build scripts? Really? How do you maintain YAML? I mean, you cannot debug it. You cannot test it until you actually build your pipeline. If you have one space you're missing, the whole thing falls apart. You cannot run it locally. You cannot refactor it. And that's why I like C# for build scripts. And I use a library called Nuke for that. Not the best name in the current state of affairs in the world. But yeah, it's a C# library, and it's just a NuGet package that you can use, and it actually creates a fully functional build pipeline. So it looks like this if you run it locally. It's just a bunch of classes. You can run it at the command line. You see all the targets. If you're old enough, you may remember Make, this old stuff. It looks like Make, but then in C#. It can generate these nice visual plans. So you see all the dependencies, and you see the order and things are executed, which is not something you can do with YAML. And you run this locally. So you build, deploy, debug everything, because this is what it looks like. It's just C#. That's nice. It's a tiny little library that really made our life easier, especially because build pipelines tend to become more complicated over years. If you do infrastructure as code, you're also introducing a lot of other elements to it. This allows me to adopt the build pipeline as part of a feature in the same pull request, test it locally, and then actually push it to to GitHub or Azure DevOps if you want to, and it just works. And it supports every other tool. Even if it doesn't support it, it's very easy to use any tool that you already have. It's a nice thing. It's created by Matthias. What was his last name? Matthias Koch. It's a German guy. That doesn't change anything. It's just a good tool. No, I really, it's a really good friend of mine. Another thing is, which I also practice a lot in my projects and my clients, is that, APIs tend to break. Not because we're bad developers, just because we forgot about the impact. And being able to have a package which API doesn't break, you have some guarantee that you didn't break anything, can be very useful. We actually introduced accidental breaking changes in our library, which caused an issue. We had to roll back or issue a new release because of that, because we didn't detect that. We thought this is not a breaking change. We're adding an optional parameter or something like that. But it actually caused binary breaking changes. So what we use first a tool, an open source library called Public API Generator, which produces an XML, sorry, it's still XML, representing the service area of a particular assembly in .NET. So it includes everything, whether it's a public, internal, protected member, the parameters, the return types, everything. That's one thing. And then we use another tool called Verify that allows me to compare two XML files. And that together produces basically a unit test that will verify whether something broke. So what we do is we put a snapshot in source control. And as part of the build pipeline that I just mentioned, we run this particular test. So if somebody actually accidentally broke something, that test will fail. But since you can actually run this pipeline locally and it's run as part of the pull request, you get early feedback. If somebody purposely wants to change, introduce this change, they can improve that. There's a PowerShell script that takes the new SHAP snapshot and the old one, updates it in source control, and then during the code, during the code review, you actually see the change. You can explicitly approve that change. This has helped a lot. Yes, question.
Is that your optional parameter that you have?
Yes, because optional parameters are actually call side changes and not binary changes, for example. Benchmarking, everybody cares about performance, right? But it's not something we should optimize upfront. But it can be important. So what we use is benchmark.net, which is like micro benchmarks. We don't run them as part of the build pipeline because that would require you like stable hardware, which we typically don't have in the cloud. Did something fell off? That's a good bad sign. Okay, like this. So we use them for certain expensive operations. We have this API which does a very deep analysis of two object graphs. We use this to verify that we didn't break anything. Especially if somebody complains about the performance, we then go back, we run this tool on a particular machine, like my local desktop, and then we go back to a previous version and see if there were any differences. So you shouldn't trust that blindly. They're not absolute numbers, but they will give you an indication whether something went bad. And in the past, you would have to use profilers or something like that. This is much easier because it's very focused. It's very smart. It does warm up and, shutdown test. It runs this a couple of times. It gives you so much information, like almost it's an overload of information, but it has saved us a couple of times making mistakes. The flip side is that some contributors, again, probably the ones with OCDC, which I have myself, by the way, as well, to try to improve the code base and make it even faster. Again, sometimes we reject those changes because they don't always make the code easier to understand. And that is similar to a real project. I don't want to optimize my code base unless there's a real reason for that. I mean, we don't have to make stupid mistakes, but you still have to use common sense. And, you have sometimes developers that really love to tweak the code base, make it faster, even it's completely irrelevant on the big scale. Like, they're optimizing a dictionary, say, yeah, we need to use this other dictionary type because it's much faster, when the database is the big problem here. And then using an actual profiler will help you that. It's called premature optimization. Micro benchmarks can help with that. If you figured out that's the black spot in your code base, that's the bottleneck. Same here. Documentation, yes, we need to have documentation. This is the website, which we actually created with minimal mistakes, which is a Jekyll template, which is quite nice because we can actually build the website locally. We can test it. If a pull request, if a feature affects the documentation, then the pull request will also update the markdown files that build the website. So if you're building an internal library, like usually there's platform teams in a big organization that build reusable components, this is a nice way to actually build documentation for your packages. I've done that. I've introduced it with one of my clients as well. Because people are always struggling, like, how do I create SDKs for my library? It's a complicated library. We want people to use it, but they're struggling with it. And of course, in the .NET space, you get automatic documentation as part of your code base if you document everything correctly. But it doesn't give you this holistic overview. Creating some kind of Jekyll website is easy. And especially if you use GitHub, you can also publish this on the internal GitHub network and make it available. But you can publish it anyway. And it's pretty easy to do. I mean, I'm not a real website developer. I suck at CSS and stuff like that. But using some of these templates makes it easy, right? Spell checking. Yeah, we use, this is maybe I'm shouting or it's cursing in the .NET space. I'm using an NPM library to do spell checking. Again, I like to use different tools. And David Whitney mentioned this morning we should try different tools. So, don't not specialize. So I've actually have somebody contribute to this. I didn't even know about this library, C-Spell. But yeah, it solves also the issue that people start creating pull requests with just spell checking mistakes and grammatics checks. It can do that for you. So in terms of reviewing, until what time do I have, by the way? I forgot to check again. Until 10 past or 20 past? 20 past, so I still 20 minutes. I'm halfway. No, just kidding. Reviewing and merging, yeah, that's another topic. First of all, we're using GitHub Actions. If you're on a GitHub space, you know this. There's nothing special about it. If you're on Azure DevOps, you use pipelines. If you're on different platforms, I don't know, maybe TeamCity or Maven or whatever. That's one thing. Obvious, I'm still using YAML, but a minimum amount of YAML just to kick off my Nuke build script. This is what it looks like. I use dependable.lot. So one of the strong cases for GitHub and one of the big issues with Codebase, like I'm in the client that uses Azure DevOps, a lot of these projects are behind on the dependencies. Every project uses open source libraries, whether it's NuGet or NPM or something else, even PHP. There's one team that does it. The biggest issue is keeping all these packages up to date. Dependable, I think, is the unique selling point of GitHub. It will scan your repositories. It will create pull requests for you, telling you how to update a particular dependency. And you can. It's very smart. They use AI these days to also figure out, like, okay, if you've been declining certain pull requests for certain packages, it won't ask you again. But it has saved us a lot. Also finds vulnerabilities, even on my website, because this website that I just showed you is using JavaScript. And it will find packages that are mistaken. Or even Ruby. There's a Ruby pipeline behind that will get updated for you. And you get all these, it's probably difficult to read, but all these improvements. It will give you all these vulnerabilities. It will fix them for you. And you can even be smart enough, like if you're using XUnit actually consists of 4 or 5 NuGet packages. You can group them. You can tell it, like, I want those to be always updated together. You can just provide a YAML file, and GitHub will be smart enough to do that. That on itself is already worth the move from Azure DevOps to GitHub. I wrote a blog post about that, by the way. CodeQL is another recent feature where you can allow GitHub to scan your code for common mistakes. It's a bit similar to what SonicCloud is trying to do, but it also finds, you're putting passwords in your repository. That's something you shouldn't be doing. Azure DevOps doesn't do this. GitHub does it, which is not surprising because you can see where the investment is. Code coverage. Who has a code coverage higher than 90%? Honestly. Oh, 2 people. Who has no code coverage? Okay, that's good. Less than 50%? No, nobody is bold enough to admit that. Fluent Assertions has a code coverage of 97%. Now you're supposed to say, wow. No, it's ridiculous. It doesn't make sense at all. Nobody should have that code coverage that high. It's just because there were all these contributors that really wanted to find these edge cases and created pull requests with more unit tests. Because more unit tests is not necessarily the best thing. And that's a completely different talk, talking about the scope. I would say around between 80 and 90 should be healthy enough, because there's certain parts of the code base which are difficult to test and you shouldn't even do it. It's not worth the investment. It should also never be used as a KPI. Managers love, I've worked at a client where the managers love to put all these KPIs on the dashboard. So if a repository didn't meet the 90%, it became red. It was discussed in, quarterly meetings and stuff like that. That is stupid. I'm not very opinionated, but I think that's stupid. And I told them, because it doesn't help. Because that's what people do. They create all these unit tests that actually make your code more difficult to refactor. It's very difficult to judge that. It depends on the code base. The same, if anybody using a SonicCloud or SonicCloud or something like that, the duplication indicator, disable that. It doesn't make sense. It actually leads to overuse of the don't repeat yourself principle. Again, different talk. By the way, we use JetBrains Codana. I think SonicCloud is actually pretty good. I thought it declined in quality. And then JetBrains offered, because it's an open source project, to use this one. We've been piloting it with them. Pretty nice, actually, I have to say. Whether you use it, it doesn't matter. It can be useful. It actually found issues in the code base that we had to improve, which actually increased our code coverage as well. What I like myself, I don't know if you've seen this before, I can be a nitpick when I do code reviews. I remember that I was joining a client and there was a guy working there that I actually worked with 15 years ago. And he still remembered me because I was at that time the guy that printed out code on paper and then used a red pencil to find the bugs. I'm kind of still that guy, but the difference is now I force myself to really consider, like, what kind of comment is this? And emojis actually help me. So you find things like this wrench which actually means this needs to be changed in principle. I mean, you can disagree, but it needs to be changed. I use the thinking phase. Like, I think something is wrong here, something fishy. Let's talk about that. I use the pickaxe, which is from nitpicking. And if I use that, my first thought is, okay, shouldn't even mention this because I'm obviously nitpicking. And by doing that, this forces me to think about it. Because remember, I worked with, let's say, junior developers, and I was the architect, and they thought like, okay, Dennis made that statement. Now I have to change that. And this was not my intention. I was actually trying to make them think about the changes. And this helped me. Like a seed, it's basically, I don't want you to change something. I just want you to put something in your mind so the next time you do something similar, you may actually think about that. Or where is it? Is it on the picture? No, you don't see it. Campground. There's a little tent. It's this principle of how far do you go with refactoring? Well, it's leave the campground cleaner than you got there. So I also do that. So I know that this is not part of your pull request. I know this is not something you've changed, but maybe there's an opportunity to make it a little bit better in your pull request. This has helped me tremendously. Initially, people start to make fun of you. Like, why are you using these stupid emoji? You're not 20 anymore. Yeah. Well, my kids don't even use emojis. They don't even use periods at the end of the sentence, right? In fact, they don't even do sentences anymore. It's just like words on every line. That's apparently a thing. Anybody doing that here as well? No, just kidding. I see somebody who's really young nodding like, okay. It's a generational thing. So this helped me. Another thing is, and this is very difficult, saying no. At NDC London, there was a really good talk about being a professional and that sometimes you have to say no. I know that Uncle Bob is sometimes seen as controversial, but he wrote a book called Clean Coder, which is not about being a coder, it's being a professional. And one of the chapters is about saying no. And we had to say no. Remember the dataset thing I just mentioned? We should have said no. But we want to be friendly to the contributor. We want to be open. We want to be, diverse in everything. Sometimes you have to say no. And for the interesting thing, I'm really good at saying no at my job. But as an open source developer, I'm not that good at it. I'm also not very good at saying no. I'm very assertive at my job, but in a shop, I tend to not ask too many questions. Yeah. But this is part of the job. Sometimes you have to do that. The other thing is, there's two guys, me and another guy that maintains this code base. And interestingly enough, he's a bit younger than me. And we have a different perspective on code bases. I used to be very nitpicky, as I just said. I try to change that. He's very nitpicky, which is a good thing. So we actually look at different perspectives. I look at the readability in general. I like to look at the whole, like, does it holistically make sense? But I don't look at the details too much, probably because I'm lazy. And he actually, Jonas, it's a good guy actually, he likes to look at details. He actually looks at consistency, like, oh, in this pull request, we actually had that discussion. He remembers that. I don't remember that because I'm old. And that's useful. So it's not that we both want to prove something in a sense that we really want to be nitpicking there, but we have different perspectives. And usually that helps. So he approves my pull requests, I approve his pull request, and we together approve other people's pull requests, which is a nice way. More than two, I would never do in a project. But also at my clients' projects, I always propose or suggest you have two reviewers, just to have two different perspectives on it. Ideally, and that's sometimes difficult to achieve, have reviewers from two different teams because they look at it from different perspectives, which some people will say, it's too puristic, takes too much time, but it can be very useful. And clean source control history. Who cares about clean source control history? Whoever looks back in source control history trying to understand what changed. I do that a lot. And there's a lot of people that don't care. I see, like in SQL, in .NET, you have this class SQL command, and it has a default timeout. I think it's 15 seconds. So at some point in the code base, I was doing some refactoring. I saw somebody saying SQL command timeout was set to 60 seconds. And I was wondering, why would you do that? What kind of query takes 60 seconds and you can get away with that? So I went back in source control, did a blame, and guess what I found? A commit saying increased SQL timeout to 60 seconds. That's the thing. That's a problem. I want to understand why. What kind of issue did you run into that you had to do that? Because understanding other developers, worm in their brain is very difficult. I mean, first level is being able to understand the code as is this, but being able to understand why that code changed in such a way, it's almost impossible without clean source control history. So I like to use rebases. I do fix-up commits. I do interactive rebases. I try to avoid merges because they create all these lines and makes it very difficult to do that. A lot of developers don't get that, and they don't like that I'm actually pushing for that. They think I'm nitpicking. I'm actually not nitpicking. I honestly believe that it will help me and help them in the future. They just don't get it yet. And they probably don't look back at the history because it never helped them, because they couldn't make heads or tails out of that. So this is difficult to achieve. This article that I mentioned earlier, like 16 aliases as a pro, is very useful. There's also, I wrote a blog post how I do this, which tools I use to actually keep my history clean. If you're in, I think maybe it's on the slides. If not, you can always ping me on Twitter or LinkedIn or whatever. And that's also why I typically don't create a merge commit. We use squash commits for that. Auto-merging by default, by the way, is actually available in GitHub for a while. I know Azure DevOps said it. We use this a lot because then both me and Jonas, who are in different time zones, as soon as we both approve the pull request, it gets merged automatically because we have build pipelines that do everything that we need to be needs to be done to feel confident that we didn't break anything. Releasing, well, a couple of things. Semantic versioning, Git version, and Git flow. I don't know if you know. This is semantic versioning. Basically, you know, when the major number increases, it's a breaking change. This happens every 2 or 3 years. A minor version means new features, completely backwards compatible, might also be bug fixes. You can safely upgrade. There's no reason to be afraid. Dependabot, for example, understands that. So if you have, I don't know, 6.9 of my library and 6.12 exists or is released, it will automatically tell you, hey, you can actually use 6.12. And it should be completely safe. In reality, not always, but in our case, of course, it's safe. And the last one actually means, hey, you should upgrade because there's a bug fix. Very simple process. I hope everybody's doing that. If you're not doing it, please start doing it because it makes it so easy to reason about a particular release. We use Git flow, which is one of the many different ways of structuring your branching. Sometimes we use GitHub flow, which is another version. I'm not going to explain the difference. The point is that there's 2 or 3 very standardized industry standard. I mean, they evolved organically, but standardized branching and merging strategies because it makes them quite, if you know them, you know actually what to expect. If you see a repository with a main or master and a develop and a release, you know it's Git flow and you know what to expect. And that's cool. And if you then use a tool like Git version, which by the way is a .NET tool, but it also has a CLI tool that can generate version numbers by looking at the last tags on your branch, at the branch name, and understands that if you're working on develop, that's probably your next version. And it will automatically add unstable and add all kinds of numbers to it. So you never have to update your version numbers manually. If you're still doing that, use something like this. It's so easy. You never look back. And it produces something like this, which you can use in your build pipeline. There's lots of numbers. You won't be able to read that. But there's all kinds of different versions, NuGet versions, semantic versions, numbers that you can embed in your assembly, even including the hash key of your commit, which removes the burden of tagging your assemblies, your DLLs and executables with the right version. And you can use the Nuke, and that's what it looks like. Nuke has it built in. So again, it's a C# file. Releasing, I don't know if you're using GitHub, but if you use GitHub, it's actually very easy to create releases. I'm currently at a client that uses Azure DevOps. I wasn't aware that it's so backwards compared to GitHub. It's a surprising amount of features that is missing. You can even generate release notes. That is, again, something we don't bother. Well, we do bother, but we don't bother writing them. We just generate them. And you can use templates to indicate like which pull requests have which labels. And based on that, you can generate release notes. It includes the names. You can see my name in yellow because that's the one I am. But also mention new contributors, which is also nice because it gives them extra visibility. Again, for open source projects, that's cool. But also for internal projects, that's also nice because actually it creates awareness of people that work in a company. You know, if you're working in a bigger company, you may not know everybody. By getting this inner sourcing ID and adopting these tools, you actually get to know new people. Like, hey, it's the same guy again or the same girl again that's contributing again. Okay, who is that? Maybe I should reach out and thank that person for what they did. Or have some coffee about what, you know. I noticed that you have a lot of contributions. Do you want to play a different role? You know, do you want to be part of the discussions? that even creates this social aspect, which you wouldn't expect if you look at the tools in this talk in general. This is very NuGet specific. You can actually reserve prefixes. So in this case, it means nobody else on the whole world can push NuGet packages with the name Fluent Assertion in it. It's reserved. You have to ask for permission. You can also do this internally, by the way. But if you're a company that adopts more open source, but also contributes open source, that's a nice way of protecting your company's name. Yes. Well, it's a project, and it means I discover new things every day. In fact, every time I did this talk, there was somebody in the audience that had a good idea that we should adopt. And I've been adopting that. That's cool, because that's what I said about learning. There's still a couple of things to do. We're working on the next major version. The last major version is from, I think, even before COVID. So it's about time. And this whole semantic version thing that I mentioned earlier also forces us to think about backwards compatibility, but also forces us to postpone certain breaking changes. And that's good, because breaking changes actually prevents ripple effects, prevents people from, or helps people avoid and adopt new versions also. So we aggregate all these improvements, and then every couple of years we release something new. Same thing happens with our internal projects. Introducing breaking changes is something you need to avoid. You need to plan accordingly, because it's causing mayhem. In fact, if you're working in an internal project, if you release a new major version, you probably have to maintain the old versions. And nobody wants to maintain 6 different versions of the same code base, right? It creates pain, it creates merging problems. You know, if you fix versions, if you fix a bug on an older version, you have to upmerge all of that. And depending on the maturity of your code base, if you have pipelines, if you can actually release without doing any manual testing, that can become a real burden. So we also do that the same way. V7 is the next version. The good thing is a new major version also allows you to introduce breaking changes, which allows you to fix all these mistakes that you made in the past, because we all make design mistakes. You know, no architecture design is correct the first time, also not the second time. It probably is never correct, because you get new insights, the world changes about that. So that's the benefit of a major version. I haven't finished all the naming thing. We still have to do that. Something like guidelines. I also see that at my clients' projects. Every repository, especially if there's real substantial code bases in there, has some implicit guidelines. Who actually captures all their design guidelines? No, because nobody does that. Because a lot of developers just copy-paste from what they've seen already, right? Or maybe because you're already aware of the guidelines, because you chose particular design strategies, you chose particular design patterns, but you want other people to be part of that as well. So capturing them is pretty important. I do that at the repository level for the things that are specific to that code base. Of course, I like to enforce that if there's a way of doing that. But everything higher up, I actually like to capture that, for example, in Confluence. We use architectural decision records. I don't know if you've heard about that. Why statements, why as in the Y, the letter Y, is a very nice way of capturing design decisions, which we do a lot. And for Fluent Assertions, I also have to do that. There's a lot of implicit decisions that evolved over the time, and we should actually write them down, because it helps contributors to understand what to expect. Mutation testing. Has anybody tried that, mutation testing? Yes, cool. It's a tool, exists in multiple platforms. In .NET, it's called Striker.net. So I suspect there's a Java version called Striker. What it will do, it will actually change your code base and see if there's any test breaking. So if your code base contains an equals operator, it will change that in a not equals operator. And that should actually break tests. So now you wonder, like, how did we get this 97% coverage? It's because people are using that tool all the time and finding gaps in our code coverage and creating unit tests for that. That's why we have 97%, because this tool, it's very useful though, because if you have your own code base, your production system, it's a very good tool to find all these gaps that you may not find in production until it fails. So definitely recommend it. It takes quite a lot of time to run. You need a big machine. It can take hours if you're not lucky. So it probably is something that you could run in your pipeline, but not every pull request, maybe every week or something like that, or occasionally. ArcUnit, I think it's also a .NET library that you can use to check dependencies, which is nice, especially if you want to make sure that people don't create dependencies that shouldn't exist between different projects, or in C# different namespaces. I haven't tried it myself, but I still want to do that. And as I said, we were using Jekyll and this minimal mistake format. Somebody actually told me I should try Docusaurus. Apparently, it makes it a lot easier to create websites for internal projects. So something that we need to try. I'm running out of time, which I'm finished just in time. I think I showed you a lot of stuff, a lot of items, a lot of tools, practice, and mechanism. I hope there's something for you there that you haven't seen before that you feel like, okay, we should probably try that. If you have more questions, I'll be around for the rest of the conference. I'm also reachable of all these channels. There's too many. I need a tool that actually posts on Mastodon, Twitter, and Blue Sky at the same time because it's difficult to keep up. Thank you for the attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.